Thank you, Gabby. Okay, so now let's dive into today's session. My name is Jamili Baroud. I'm a curriculum and evaluation consultant here at LDDI. With me today, co-hosting are my colleagues Gabrielle Coombs, learning designer, and Melanie Corbett, marketing and communications assistant. So our Viewpoints event encourages faculty, students, and staff to engage with relevant topics that raise pedagogical questions and can be viewed from various perspectives. So we hope this space and time will provoke deeper thinking about how technology is inspiring or reshaping the way we approach podcasting as creative pedagogy. Before we introduce the three incredible presenters we have lined up for you today, we would like to acknowledge that UBC and the servers that we are using for this virtual session are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And because we are discussing creative pedagogy today, I would also like to recognize the deep loss of Indigenous languages caused by colonization and honor all ongoing efforts to preserve and revitalize them. So may this acknowledgement inspire reflection and action toward reconciliation and language revitalization. Okay, so now we're going to be introducing the three wonderful panelists that we have with us today. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Van Weinsberg, who is a professor in the Faculty of Education at UBC in the Adult Learning and Education program. His research expertise is in sustainability and the related areas of social movements and capacity building, and is rooted in an interest in human action and social change. He works to step outside the traditional.
You muted yourself by mistake, I think.
Oh, thank you. Where did I leave off here? Well, we're talking about Rob, and he works hard to step outside the traditional classroom and to reconceptualize adult learning and community engagement to contribute to progressive social movements, seeking sustainability, social justice, and decolonization. So welcome, Rob. We also have with us today Dr. Daniel Cox, a professor here at the University of British Columbia and host of the podcast Psychotherapy and Applied Psychology. Dan does mental health research on helping and change processes, particularly related to suicide. Dan is involved in several funded projects examining how to best help those in suicidal crisis. So welcome, Daniel. I also have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Iris Berger, who has been involved in the field of early childhood education as a classroom teacher, researcher, community organizer, policy consultant, and university instructor since the mid-1990s. In her teaching, Dr. Berger focuses on creating pedagogical spaces that convey a sense of welcoming and possibilities for collaborative thinking, dialogue, and engagement, while at the same time provoking intellectual restlessness and questioning that invite an experience of awakening to new ideas and perspectives. So in today's session, we'll ask each of our panelists to take a few minutes to share their viewpoints on podcasting as creative pedagogy. And then we'll open the floor for a general discussion and invite any questions or comments that you might have. But throughout, you are invited to post comments or questions in the chat at any time, and we'll keep an eye on it. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Van Weinsberg to share a bit more about his work and perspectives on podcasting. So thank you, Rob, and welcome.
Oh, hi. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you. I have limited experience in trying to do podcasting. So what I thought I would do is talk about one of my efforts to do this, and then perhaps the question period would be a time to talk about the implications. This way, I'm not trying to offer these grand ideas that I haven't really thought through carefully. So what I'm going to talk to you about is an effort to build podcasts in a specific course. And that course is called EDST 503, or Educational Studies 503. It's called the Foundations of Adult Learning and Education. And so one of the course requirements in last year's version of the course, in the 2024 version of the course, was to build podcasts. So what I'll do is just take you through that course requirement, show you a little bit about how it built community within the cohort itself of people, and then give you a kind of an example of what we were trying to do, and hopefully that gives you some sense of possibility. And then in the question period, maybe we can draw out some of the implications. So I hope everybody can see this. So if you can't, let me know. I'm sorry for all the text, and I think there's two ways. You can just read this, or I can speak to it. What I was trying to do was to take dialogue, which I'm familiar with, and to try to put it in a format that allowed it to be a kind of spontaneous conversation amongst institutions. So the question on the table is, what and how should adults know and learn from our major social institutions in regards to climate change? So my thinking in putting this together as a course requirement was that institutions themselves play an incredibly important role in social change. Often we don't think about them because they have a kind of intermediate role between the individual and the social structure, but I think they're absolutely vital. They also are in a situation now where many people are asking them to change their functions. So you can think about your kind of favorite one: the family, religion, government, sport, and social media, and a kind of general request that we might be making of these social institutions to change in regards to issues like climate change, but not just climate change. So I thought that was an important kind of piece to talking about issues like sustainability, like climate change, because I believe that's where change will come. So we might want to think about education as an example. So I asked students to form groups, and I went through a process of developing the ways that we would engage and find and engage representatives of these social institutions. So we wanted to get the right people at the table and have them come in, talk about what they saw their jobs in light of climate change being, how they may have changed because of climate change, how they anticipated them changing, and to have them also talk to other social institutions about what they were doing. And then in the process of having that dialogue, coming up with ways they might support one another. So that was the course requirement. And I'll give you a quick example of what the students produced, and this will give you some sense of the examples. So this is a kind of prospectus of one of the actual conversations. So we had students working together in groups of 3 or 4, and we said, bring together 2 institutions that you feel might be able to inform one another. So in the particular case that you're looking at right now, we had Wendy Itagawa come in, and she basically is responsible for the replacement project at the Patella Bridge. Very impressive woman, engineer by training, but obviously lots and lots of skills. And the story of the replacement of the Patella Bridge is a very, very interesting one. And then in addition to that, we brought in Jenny Klutz, who's a former PhD student in educational studies, who did a really, really fascinating dissertation trying to look at Indigenous engagement and trying to write a dissertation that was completely respectful of her being a settler and wanting to learn. And at the time, she was working at UBC in the SEEDS program. She since moved on to the city of Coquitlam. So this just gives you some example of what we were doing. So we had the guests come, we met the guests, we sort of brought them into our traditional classroom, and then we moved on and went to the specific studio where we put together the podcast. And Eduardo was there, Miriam was there, Jamili was there. It was a situation where we were trying to be good hosts. We were bringing experts in. We were trying to invite them into our cohort, into our community. And so we greeted them at harvest. We made sure that they had something to drink and something to eat. And then we went and did the podcast And then after the podcast, we invited them back into our classroom where we shared a meal. Some of the students were in the studio itself, the members of the group were there, but other people were in the classroom itself watching the podcast, or listening to the podcast rather. So that was kind of an interesting situation that we did, and it was one of the more experimental pieces. So now what I'd like to do is to just have you listen to part of one of the podcasts, and I'll set this up technologically, and then I'd like to set it up just as an explanation. Okay, so this particular podcast has representation from the military and representation from mainstream religion. And so I've set this up as a conversation where I've just asked the question, how has the military changed in response to climate change? Now, I am the interviewer in this case, but in the other 4 podcasts that we did in the class, it was a class member. This was the first one. So I took it on and I learned a tremendous amount. It is quite interesting to be the person responsible for doing the interviewing and trying to read the room. Even though you have a script, you never know what's going to be said, and you may want to build on that. So let me play this. I will play this for 2.5 minutes. Amelia, is that okay? 2.5 more minutes? Okay, and then I'll stop right at the end of that 2.5 minutes.
Ago, all the talk about being prepared for a natural disaster, and especially in this region, has always been about earthquake. Probably, now don't quote me on this, but in the 2000s, the first 10 years of the 2000s, we were probably called out 5 times in 10 years. Now we've called out 8 times in 1 year.
So I want to explore what you might think of the others institution in regard to climate change. So it's when you look across at Chris and you hear what you've heard, and you know what you know, are there questions that you have for Chris about the church and about climate change? And I'm going to get us towards a kind of conversation about collaboration, but are there things that you think of that might allow the church to think more expansively, some suggestions, some ideas about how the church could be playing a role? Because sometimes when you're inside something, you don't see it for what it could be to the same extent as an informed person. So is there anything that you see about the church and in regards to climate change?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, right? We've talked in the past, the military is very much a cause and effect sort of organization, right? And we plan towards an outcome, we try to achieve that aim, and then we've hit sort of a mission success and we move on to our next thing. Whereas I feel with the church, having listened to you speak a little bit about it and the stewardship function that comes along with it, right? Like stewardship doesn't have an end goal. Per se. So I think that the church has an area to play that would be interesting in a more holistic approach to how to address climate change. See, the concept, even if I put on the uniform and I think about climate change, instantly I'm thinking about how to solve it. But is it a solvable component, right? Or is it a livable aspect that we adjust with our life around? So that'd be interesting to hear from your perspective of how you see the church play a role.
And I respect what you said, the mission oriented aspect where there's a crisis and you're deployed to help, to solve, to fix, and you do have goals. And in one respect, I like the idea of being able to tick off mission accomplished. Yeah. Whereas for us sometimes it's like ongoing. And you have to find your own sort of milestones or benchmarks, but yours is a bit more defined, which I like. When I look at the military, I wonder sometimes, and maybe I don't know the full story of it, but is there anything proactive that's being done? Like for example, you went down and took care of and helped out with the flooding in the Fraser Valley a few years ago. Was it just going in and cleaning up, or is there an opportunity for you, the military, to work with those communities and say, okay, in the future, here's some things that can, you can do, like the engineers can go in and work there. Or same thing with the fires.
It's an interesting point. So I've been on 2.5, 3 fires now over successive years, including this year where I was up north. We always play support roles. So we're there in support, generally speaking, of BC Wildfire Services. First time out, we go very much just get into the fire, do the mop up, not the front line, not the type 3 and 4 firefighting, or type 1, sorry, but the ones that allow to free up those skilled resources.
Okay, I'll stop there. And let me just add a little bit of context. The beginning features Colonel Verk talking about the military being asked to fight wildfires. And what he was explaining is that from 2000 to 2010, every second year or thereabouts, they were called to support. And what he's explaining is that most recently, they're going out 2-3 times per year to fight wildfires. In addition to that, they receive training at the beginning, but with the intensity of the wildfires, with the number of the wildfires, they're now going into more intense situations with less training. What that creates is a form of PTSD that later in the podcasts, Reverend Pappas suggests could be a place where religion plays, the church plays a kind of a role in helping people to get some sort of solace or to be able to talk to people while they're at the wildfires. So we do a subsequent podcast with Eduardo and Jamili where they come back together having reflected on that possibility. I think that's available on the LDDI website, but that's the rest of the context, and I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. So we're now going to pass over to Dr. Cox. So Dan, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's see here. I'll start a timer so that way when I get talking, I don't talk for too long. All right, so I don't have an actual presentation, but I did sort of put together some notes. So just to give sort of a general framework. So for my podcast, so what I have is a weekly podcast. And so it has both audio and video being put on YouTube, audio on anywhere you download podcasts. And episode 42 was released today. So I'll drop the links in the chat in a moment. But anyway, so the idea with my podcast, where I sort of was like, so I do like psychotherapy, counseling research, sort of how to help people better, and then how to help people better. And so what my experience is I was going to all these different like conferences and talking to all these people and reading lots of papers as one does. And I was like, there are so many people who are doing such amazing things that have real world implications that aren't getting to practitioners, people in the field, just because, there aren't great mechanisms for communicating this stuff. And, if an academic writes a book, sure, or records a training video, but even that, there's all sorts of like walls that get in the way of normal people learning about what these, in my opinion, wonderful folks are doing. So my thinking was there is a gap here, and like I can kind of fill that gap because I sort of can speak both languages and can bring on folks who are generally my criteria. So it's primarily a guest driven show or an interview driven show. So my criteria for inviting folks is like, one, that they are a strong researcher. So stuff that I think is, what they're saying, what they're selling is valid. And two, that it's actually, meaningful for people in the field. So that's kind of the idea behind it. And so that's what I do is I invite on folks from all over the world to come on and talk about their research. And I always sort of prime them on the front end that it's not like, I don't want you to talk particularly to researchers, who I want you to be talking to are people in the field or people training to be in the field. So it's sort of like how I tend to think about it, although there are undergrads that listen, I tend to think about it more like for graduate students who are training to be practitioners, psychologists, counselors, social workers, psychiatric nurses, whatever it happens to be. But then also people who are actually in the field doing the work. So that's what the show is. So what I did, and I was sort of like in prepping for this, I just started like writing stuff down, and I realized, oh my God, I do have a lot to say. So I tried to sort of streamline it a bit. And what I'm going to hit first is like, here's the stuff that I would suggest before you're going to start one. Okay, so this is like the actual, like the most important stuff. So the first thing is to actually like write down your goals, your desires, your motivations, who it's for, the gap you're filling, what your intentions are, what like just to write it down. And over time, like as you're sort of daydreaming about it, just like write down your ideas, or you just write down that stuff, because there's this weird phenomena that happens where like once you start, a lot of that will like go away. Like it's sort of like, if you think about like the day before you went to university and the day after you went to university, it's like the day before you went to university for the first time, you had these thoughts about what it would be like, why you're doing it, what you're hoping to get out of it. And then the first day you go, now you're a university student. So your identity has changed. And like there's something in that identity change that like you just lose a lot of stuff. And like it's kind of the same thing. It's like once you release that first podcast into the world, it's like now you're a podcaster. Maybe not a big podcaster, maybe not successful, but you are a podcaster. And so like your identity changes. So I think it's super important to write that, just loosely, not in any structured way, not in any, write it down on paper, but just, as you're daydreaming, just like, what am I thinking about right now? So that way you can sort of, you won't lose that. And then like, once you get started podcasting, if that's where you're going to go, that like to both be able to reference that, but also recognize like, what are the things that I really like about this, and hold on to those things. For most of us, we're doing it for any number of reasons, but part of it is because we want to, because there's something fun about it, something enjoyable. And it just like any, task you take on, there's all the other stuff, right? There's all the other stuff that is not fun. That is not why you decided to do this. And so make sure to like see what the things that you cared about, make sure to hold on to those things. And if you can't hold on to them, if you're like, I can't do this and hold on to this, then don't do it, then drop it. Like it's cool. But I think that's super important. Another thing before you get started is, and even if I were just doing it in a class, I would like, what is the function of this? And do your best to have it serve multiple functions. So for me, it serves the function of disseminating information out there, but it serves a lot of other functions too, which is like, I think particularly, through COVID and stuff, a lot of community was lost. And then since with so many people being remote, it's sort of like there just isn't as much community around, right? It's sort of harder. And I was like, I want to create community. And so that was one of my goals, is like talking to the people in my field, spending somewhere between 1 and 2 hours with them, just talking about what they're doing, what they care about, what they're passionate about, is like, has helped for me to like develop this community. So when I go to conferences or in other contexts, like I'll get emails or refer all these different things, like, so it's helping me to build community, which I really value, and was kind of missing and is important to me. It also like, the connection piece of it has been huge. Either the people that I've had on as guests, or people that they have sort of referred to, or listeners that through all of those, and maybe there's other ones, but through all those different connection points that I'm making through doing it, I've been on several grants, one of which just got funded because of it, been co-author, whatever, collaborator on several papers, been invited to give several different presentations at other types of things. So it's just like, it just helps to build your network. And, it wasn't necessarily in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, these sorts of more tangible benefits could come from it, but that wasn't my main motivation, but it just has sort of come. And that's what comes when you build your network, right? So I think having it serve multiple functions, or if it's just going to be like you doing it and talking about things that, so like maybe this is a medium for me to really help to form my ideas and shape my ideas because I'm working on a book. And so I'm going to use this to form and shape ideas that are later, several of them will turn into chapters or part of chapters in my book or whatever it happens to be. So just sort of think about how can I use this for multiple functions, or like, so I'll have on people on my podcast that I'm like, this really relates to what I'm teaching in my class or going to teach in my class. So, and this is, it's so much nicer for the students to have some assignments that aren't reading another paper or another book chapter. So I can assign my podcast as, reading for that week. So just sort of, and I can even reference the class. Oh, in my class, we're working on this. Do you have any advice for students who blah, 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 and these are the authors of the papers that we're reading or the books or the chapters that we're reading. So it sort of has this, they come with a lot of credibility. So it's great. Okay, a couple other things for suggestions. Okay, so one of the big ones is like just start. So whether you're doing it for a class or like I am sort of as like a weekly thing with a broader audience to just like, there's no way you're going to be able to figure out all the nuance of it. There's no way. So at some point you just sort of have to like jump in and do it. And it is insanely iterative. So like I look back on my first episode, my second episode, my third episode, and it changed. So, I mean, it was 3 episodes in when I was like, I got to change the title of this thing. Like, and so, it changed the title because it didn't make any sense. And, how I prepared, what I sent to people before I talked to them, how I sent it, how I communicated, all the different technology things, like it's going to change. And the only way you're going to be able to figure that out is to do it. So like, you kind of get the basic stuff and just do it. Before you like take the stress off your back and before you think like, I'm going to do this one, and then I like do several practice or like initial ones first. So if it's just going to be you like doing like, just a one person talking head podcast, then like sit down and, record it if you want and just like, try it. And it'll be terrible. And you'll be like, oh my God, I have to prep so much more. I need to prep this way. I need to do it this way. I need to figure out that. But like, you have to do it in order to figure that out. So just, and if it's going to be something we're going to be interviewing people, what I really, I did a couple, but what I really wish I would have done is like written down a list of like 5 or 10 people in my circle that I would have had on and interviewed them as guests and whatever beforehand, before starting to reach out to other people. It would have been so much less stressful. Okay, so 2 other things real quick. What I would say, the 3 most important things to podcasting: audio, audio, and audio. So it's an audio medium. Get it, it does not have to be a $500 mic, but you can get a decent mic for $50, $60, $70, whatever it is. Have good audio. Because if you listen to podcasts like I do, bad audio, sometimes I'm just like, I'm done with this podcast. I'm done. So, good audio. And the last thing I'll say is have somebody that you can like bounce ideas off of. In a perfect world, you have a couple of people, but like have people that you can just like, who don't necessarily have to be audio people or podcast people, but just people who are going to be like non-judgmental and just you can talk this stuff out with, because you'll be amazed. Sort of one is just like getting it all straight in your head. So just having somebody who can just like listen and be a sounding board, but then also just the feedback that I've gotten, both before and after, from people who are not, hardcore audio people, that they're like, oh, I think it'd be better if you did this. And sometimes I'm like, what do you give me feedback for? I don't want it. But then, you get it. And like, first you're annoyed, but then you think about it and you're like, maybe she has a point. So, yeah. So having folks you can chat with. So anyway, okay. I will stop rambling for now. I have lots more stuff, but.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Cox. That was great. So for our final panelist today, I'm going to invite Dr. Iris Berger to share some of her thoughts and experiences on podcasting with us. Take it
Thank
away,
you,
Iris.
Gabby. Thank you also, Jamili, for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. It made me think that perhaps I should move I'm dating myself too much when I say that I started in the early 90s. And I'm partly saying that because even though I'm a mature teacher, I'm pretty much a baby to podcasting. So I'll tell you about this in a second. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories, shared territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. So just like my previous panelists have done, I do want to give you a little bit of a context where I used the podcast. And I used it for an online course. The course is titled Place-Based Literacies, and a major component of this course invites the students to spend time outdoors and to think about some of the concepts that they're learning in the course in relationship to their particular environments. And then one of the possibilities for using this podcast, and that was obviously intentional. So when I recorded the content pages of the course into podcasts with the idea that students will be going outside and hopefully taking their phones or whatever the device that they would like to use and spend less time on the screen reading and listening to the content of the course while they're outside, and hopefully making those connections between the concept that they're learning about and what they're encountering in the kind of activities they're invited to do outside. So just reflecting on this particular gathering and thinking about the pedagogical aspects of using a podcast, there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention. One of them is I work a lot within an online environment of teaching and learning, and it has come to my attention, and I don't think it will be new to anyone, that adding this notion of voice to the text that might be already in the course just creates a very different learning experience. And I remember reading one time the work of, she's an Italian philosopher, and she puts a lot of emphasis on that notion that voice is very unique. Each one of us has a different voice. So adding your voice to the course, I think, brings in a kind of a presence that isn't there when the students just read the text that you have written. We also, in early childhood, but more broadly and pedagogically, do focus a lot on this notion of listening. We even use the term the pedagogy of listening. And I think that also gives the student an opportunity to think where they gather knowledge from. And I do think that we count a lot on our vision and what we see, but perhaps less on what we hear. So when I think about podcast, obviously there's audio, there's words, but within the course, I've invited the students also to listen to sound. So that was another aspect of the podcast that perhaps we didn't think about at the beginning, but that was something that I think added to the course. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't have a lot of experience with podcasts. So unlike Dan, who seems to be doing this for a while and is doing it independently, I do want to speak about the support I had from LDDI and their very professional studio. So all the recordings took place in the studio, and the post-production was also done by LDDI. All this to say that the quality of the sound was really good, that the LDDI support helped me create some pauses in the podcast so that it wasn't just continuous talking, intros and outros with some beautiful music. And just like Dan emphasized, I do think this is important in creating podcasts. I will share that in terms of technology, again, I think that this was an opportunity to kind of push myself to try something new. And I'm very fortunate to have the support of LDDI in doing so. So this is an invitation, just like Dan said, to try it, experiment and see what happens. I actually found that I thoroughly enjoyed it. So just putting it out there to give it a try. And perhaps the last thing that I will share is that not exactly podcast, but again, this power of audio, this power of listening to somebody's voice, which I think does provoke the affective. It's, oh, there is a person there, and this person might have an accent like I do, or they might be stumbling on certain words like I do. I think it's a very different way of sharing knowledge. So in a different course, one of the bi-weekly responsibility of the students, and the assignment is called the sharing circle. They also record themselves in audio. And this has been so successful that we pretty much crashed the Padlet platform last term, just because I wanted to limit the number of minutes that student could record themselves, and they just kept getting longer over the course of the term. And student also spoke a lot about how much they enjoyed doing the recording, listening to their peers, sharing their knowledge through this way. Yeah, I think that's pretty much sums it up. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Iris. So thank you so much to Rob, Dan, and Iris, all of our wonderful panelists, for sharing your unique perspectives and approaches on podcasting, all relevant and enlightening, and bringing forth lots of new and transformational ideas about how we can approach podcasting as creative pedagogy. So now we'll invite everyone to ask questions or add to the conversation. So again, lots of options for how you engage. You can use the raise your hand function on Zoom. You can unmute yourself. You can use the chat. And our wonderful panelists can jump in and hopefully answer folks' questions. So Bree, I can see that you have a question. I'm just going to...
Yeah. Dan spoke about building community and using the podcast as a methodology to kind of do that. I'm wondering if Iris or Rob found that this increased their like sense of community. I know, Iris, you talked about the text versus the voice, or if you have set up specific ways for students to like build community or discuss or chat on. I just found that particular point very interesting.
I can start, and I will very honestly say that was not the main purpose of using the podcast. The main purpose was to allow the students to listen to the content pages when they are not in front of the screen. So when they are outside and making these connections between so for example, one module could be about linguistic landscapes, which ask the students to pay attention to the kinds of languages that they notice within their community. So they might be going outside, listening to these different researchers who speak about linguistic landscape, and then they have a task to do in relationship to this. But I do think that that kind of gives me the incentive to use audio and podcasting more. And I do think that it does support building a community in a different way. So in an online teaching, we use these discussion forums, and students have communicated many times so that they've kind of had enough of these discussion forums where each week they typically have to submit some kind of a reflection about their reading. And I think podcasting audio more generally offers a really interesting, relevant, and timely alternative to these discussion posts.
I'll jump in a little bit. I use the notion of cohort instead of community, because I'm a real fan of cohorts. And I was trying to take an adult learning and education class with people who are from 8 to 10 different countries around the world, and to bring them together and to have them have a challenge and a disruption in the lives of being students. And I think podcasts do that because there's a technological aspect. There's contacting people, like actually asking people to be experts. And there's getting organized and being a good host. And all of those sort of mini hurdles facilitate a kind of we-ness that I think is really important to classrooms, especially when you have people from a variety of different places. I mean, the only corollary I would draw is perhaps potlucks. So it's like food, right? The podcast is a bit like food, brings everybody together in these smaller groups, and then in terms of the overall challenge. And so, yeah, definitely feel like, we have to do more of that as we realize what classrooms actually need to look like. So we can't hide anymore. We now know that we need guest speakers, but we now know that we have to deal with real world issues. We now know that we have to put people into projects, but they have to be heavily facilitated, because being a group member is actually quite a skill. So yeah, I'm always looking for ways to try to do those things. And to abandon lecturing, I suppose, which I never liked, nobody ever liked, but we can't hide anymore. Like I think we have to move into these areas and be challenging in a different way now. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I can see, Eduardo, you have your hand raised. Can you share your question?
Sure, absolutely. This is for three speakers. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a real pleasure listening to your ideas. Very useful. And so all of you have mentioned that you were able to do something that wouldn't have been possible in another medium, right? Like Dan, you talked about you were finding all this information, but putting it in the podcast format allow you to share it more with the community. Or maybe Iris, how people are able to go outside and listen to something as they learn. Or Rob, having these people getting together to speak, that wouldn't have been possible without having that conversation. So it was a unique input, so to speak. So I'm wondering, what have been the unique outputs that you have seen in students and in the people you're reaching to? That would be very interesting to know. Thank you.
I mean, I can jump in. I'll be pretty quick. The outputs are that in some cases, the guests continued to connect with one another about the interinstitutional aspects of their work. And that took the form, as I mentioned, of subsequent podcasts with LDDI, but actually that happened at interpersonal levels. And I think that's pretty powerful. The other thing about the podcast, I think, is you're trying to have difficult conversations sometimes, right? Like in our excerpt, you saw a military person challenging the church in a little, like, I noticed this about you, and maybe that's, and so you have to choose mediums, I think, sometimes that allow people to gently offer some critique. And a podcast seemed quite nice in that regard. I don't know if it's the culture of podcasting, because I'm not a podcaster, but it does seem to be it seems to be acceptable to ask hard questions of one another in podcasts. So perhaps it's a cultural thing, and I'll leave it there.
I can jump in. So in addition to sort of like the stuff I talked about in terms of the various outputs that have come from like the connections and things like that I've made, it's hearing from listeners. So it's hearing from either people that I know who are practitioners or students in the community who come, it's like, oh, I listened to this and I learned this, or I have one former student who listens, and so now he's all based on some of the conversations I had, motivated to sort of make some sort of a policy change based on some of the, and so in British Columbia and that sort of thing. So those are more like people that I already know. And then the other thing though is I get feedback like on YouTube where people leave comments, and in general, the comments are actually kind of great. And I get stuff from people who are practitioners, but I also get stuff from people who are struggling with mental health challenges, who are, sort of saying that, this is their experience and they really appreciated hearing blah, blah, blah. And so, you just sort of get, and, these are just the people that I hear from. So, I would, there's all sorts of other stuff that's happening that I'm not aware of. So, I mean, those are certainly some of the cooler outputs when those sort of things do happen to boomerang and come back to me. And just for everybody who's listening, I do want to say, like, having been on the other side of this, that I would have been hesitant to like bring stuff up because I'd be like, oh, that's a really small thing or that's really stupid. But like, I find that with all this podcasting stuff, oftentimes it's like the little things that kind of like get in the way of like, oh, I don't know how to do this, or I'm not sure how to do that, or I don't even. So like, feel comfortable asking questions that you feel that you're self-critical of feeling like, oh, I shouldn't ask this. Just feel comfortable. It's a lot of small questions. But anyway, to you, Iris.
Thank you. So I think we have a group of very diverse students, and for some of them, they're quite comfortable with trying new technology. But I think for those who are not, that that is the potential push that they need if they actually see that their instructor has use this methodology. And so in that particular course that I spoke about, I had a variety of projects that the students have done. Some of them in terms of the use of technology well beyond podcasting, but for some it was indeed more use of audio. And I think generally speaking, perhaps some outputs for me, just to think an alternative way of creating online courses, or perhaps some of the module that don't have to be so text heavy and are different from lecture. And I forgot to mention that I actually interviewed a PhD student who is doing work related to the course. So that is something else that we could think about for future courses, and having either local students or professors who have knowledge on particular topics, and that can also become part of the course. I just think that it gives students just a little nudge to think that they're also are capable of using these different modalities.
Great, thank you. I think that was a really wonderful sort of broad broad answer from across the panel. I can see Mariam has a question.
Hi, thank you to all the panelists. I had two questions for Dan. One question is, do you protect the podcasts that you have been creating? Like if anyone uses your podcasts, I don't know, on their website, in their courses, without letting you know? And then another question I had is, since you connect with people probably all around the world, how do you record the podcast, like over Zoom, or what are those ways? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of protecting it, so I mean, it's out there. So, anybody can rip it. I mean, theoretic, I mean, it doesn't take too much sleuthing to figure out how to download YouTube videos. So it just sort of is what it is. And I don't know, just sort of is what it is. So, I don't really, it's not like yeah, I think going into it knowing that, right? So you're not thinking I'm going to create this and it's going to be mine and nobody's going to be able to like download it, or like, as long as you go in knowing it, then yeah. Great question on the recording thing. So Zoom is fine. The nice thing about Zoom is that everybody knows how to use it more or less. So it's really easy. There are some, so I think like, particularly if that's a barrier, then just use Zoom. And it's great, go for it. And like, particularly because you can record on Zoom, it transcribes, it does that stuff. There's a few sort of major players out there that have software that you can subscribe to that is designed for podcast recording. So the one that I use is called Riverside, Riverside, Riverside. And so it captures both audio and video. You can do some audio editing on Riverside, but not, I mean, there's much more powerful audio editing software. But one of the major things that it does is that it records however many people, it records them as separate tracks, so that so you can basically, let's say that Iris and I are going back and forth, right? And so Iris is talking and I cough, right? Because there are separate tracks, you can delete my cough out of my track and it will not impact Iris's track. So that way, that's just one example, but there's tons of this sort of stuff. So anyway, so Riverside, and there's a few others that I have not used, and there's one, I always forget the names because I haven't used them. Yeah, but so Zoom, if you just want something, it's going to work, it's going to be reliable, it's going to be convenient and comfortable for everybody. If you want to get a little more sophisticated, there are some other programs that there was an education discount. I'm going to say I spend $20 a month, plus or minus $8. I don't know, but it's something like that.
On Riverside?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. I can see Harini, you also have your hand up.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. That was such a fun discussion. Thank you. I'm seeing we're really close to time, so I'm going to keep my question really short. This is related to just how all of you through these podcasts have research intentions, but also pedagogical intentions. And I'm curious to know the circularity of that feedback from the communities that you are reaching, whether it's students or whether it's your community, Dan or Iris and Rob. You had it was embedded in a course, and so how did and you did speak about this, but I'm really interested in the feedback that you got beyond. I love listening to people's voices, which of course is great, but how did that impact your teaching, their learning, even our learning, to feel more connected? Thank you.
Great question, Harini.
Thank you, Harini. I would not minimize loving to listen to people's voices or even phrase it this way, because I do think that it's important and meaningful. And as I mentioned previously, this idea that each one of us has a unique voice, and it is so different to listen to spoken words than it is to reading them on the screen or on a piece of paper. So I do think it's important. I have only taught this course online one time, and so I don't have a lot of feedback from students. I do know that they really enjoyed it, but I haven't looked into it in any systematic way. So this is something I think definitely to look into. Yeah, I think I will just leave it there. I don't have oh, I know what I was going to say. The other course where we use this notion of sharing circle, and students are invited to audio record their messages and then listen to each other. That I would say has consistently been a successful way of engaging students that I've heard a lot of good feedback on.
I can jump in fairly quickly. The circular bit is probably theoretical for me. So I do like to add into courses kind of theoretical ideas that I'm entertaining. The theoretical idea that I entertained here was the need for an interinstitutional dialogue at the scale of Canadian society in order to have a conversation about what institutions should be doing in light of the problems that we're facing, and which institution wants to take the lead on achieving sustainability. So sometimes that's not altogether fair because people come to courses for other reasons, but I'm usually fairly open about the fact that I have questions that float around and they're going to make their way into the class one way or another. So I might as well be open about it. And that's kind of what I did in this case.
So I think I'm not sure if I'm going to answer the question to an extent. Listening to the two respondents before me, I sort of wanted like, but both them said sort of hit me. I think that what Iris said to start off with about how important and how different voices are. I think that's kind of a huge thing that talking to and how it, Iris, you also said like how it's different than what's on the page, because when we write stuff, we work tirelessly to really make those words do certain things and not do other things, and just to be, and we sort of follow these certain cultural norms within our particular fields and that when you talk just like we are now, I always sort of think about it as sort of like, it's sort of like, like Oz. This is sort of like the peek behind the curtain. Like you're able to actually get the real experience of the people that are talking. And, because podcasting can be long form, it just like, usually after a little bit, some walls come down and people are able to just sort of talk about their human experience in whatever it is, whatever it is that sort of inspired them or motivated them or what. I had somebody on not too long ago who does eating disorders research, and I asked her, what I ask everybody how they got started in their discipline, and she said that when she was a teenager, she struggled with an eating disorder, and she had a therapist her therapist was amazing, and she did all, and it's just sort of like that was the attraction, and like she can't write that in her papers, in her academic papers. I mean, it just was like, it was just so human, and it just gave meaning to the entire, like everything that she's doing and what she's talking about, and it just sort of, I was able to like see the framework of everything that she's been doing for her career through a different kind of way about this wonderful experience that she had as a kid. And that the voices and what comes through in those and the conversation is just so unique. And getting to what Rob said, I think that it just also does give us most of us have this, really kind of niche expertise. And so we don't get to communicate, we get the students in our class, but then again, they usually have to be there. So they're different, and that varies, right? We all know that varies, but in terms of how much they want to be there. But it kind of gives us kind of nerdy people this opportunity to actually communicate to a whole bunch of people that we normally couldn't communicate with, who they're not in our classes, they're not reading our, uh, super niche academic papers or books or whatever it happens to be. So it just sort of, does allow us to reach that, which, I think as Rob was sort of suggesting, with the idea that maybe it'll have an impact, right? Like that, that particularly when we're bringing in other folks, right? Like we can lift up and sort of, I don't know, put in a loudspeaker some voices that we think that people should hear, that we think are really valuable.
Thank you so much. I did not at all intend to minimize the affective and the multimodal sort of and the personal connections of this at all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Harini, and thank you, Iris, Dan, and Rob, for sharing your insights. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. We've already reached 4 o'clock. That went super fast. I feel like this was such an amazing panel. So before we go, of course, we'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to our 3 panelists, Rob, Iris, and Dan. And thank you for your invaluable time and contributions to thinking about how we can leverage podcasting to enhance things like multimodality and student engagement and connection to community and land and place. So we'd like to also thank everyone here for joining our conversation today and for posing some really amazing thought-provoking questions. And so thanks everyone once again for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take good care, and we'll see you at our next Viewpoints. Thanks, everyone.